And so in order to start this series, we're going to need to grab the resources, right, to actually get going with creating the material for our asset. And so if you look down in the description of this video, you'll be able to snag the link and it will take you to this page right here. And if we come down here, we're going to get a little blurb about what this is for in case you haven't seen any of the videos before this one. And to snag this guy, we're going to go ahead and just make sure to click on the tutorial resources here and make sure that it's highlighted. And this asset is going to be open donation, meaning if you don't want to spend any money on it, all the power to you, we can go ahead. And if you want a few extra resources, such as the raw files for this series, as well as the final substance graph that we make, for $5 or more, you can have all of that as well. And a little bit of a disclaimer as well, because this is open donation, if you want to get those extra resources, you're going to have to make sure that you actually click on this guy here before you go ahead and purchase down below. So that's just a bit of a disclaimer. Otherwise, you're going to be getting the standard resources here and also providing me a generous donation. So with this one selected, we can go ahead, just type in 0 there. Oh, already got one entered. And click on I want this. And then you're going to be taken to this purchasing page where you can enter your email to save it to your library and receive the receipt for purchasing this. And then that should automatically start the download for you. All right, and so I've just gone ahead and brought the zip file onto my desktop here. And I'm just going to extract it here. And you can see this guy's popped right up here. So in this package, we're going to have 3 items immediately. And what we're going to have is the README file here. If I bring this guy over, you can see that that's just going to show us pretty much everything that's in the package, as well as a link to the original author right here, as well as a link to the original file that you're going to be able to get, the mesh, which I downloaded from 3D Model Haven, which is a great repository that just recently came out actually for just free high quality 3D assets, which you're going to be pretty much able to use for any projects that you want to work on, even commercially. You can see here, this is a little bit of an excerpt that I had taken from the site, which I think they've actually taken from the Creative Commons library online. So the gist of it is that anything in this package that you've gotten here is Creative Commons 0, which ultimately means that you're going to be able to use anything in this package for whatever project you want. Even if it's commercial, go ahead for it. I'm going to close this down. We've also got the .obj or 3D object file here. So this is the actual megaphone mesh. And then we've also got a folder with a bunch of different mesh maps. And these are all mesh maps that I've baked out for use in this tutorial. So we're going to be going ahead and using all of these throughout the remaining videos in this series. And we're going to see how we're going to use them to interact with our object and how we can use them in Substance Designer to go ahead and create our final material for our asset. All right, and so now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open up Substance Designer here. And we're going to cover how we can go ahead and start creating or setting up our working environment to start seeing how we're using our 3D mesh and our mesh maps to start our workflow for creating these unique textures. So the first thing I'm going to do is come up to File over here, and I'm going to do New Substance. And this is going to open up the new Substance graph templates. And you can see on the left side here, we've got a ton of different templates, and all these templates are just telling us, kind of setting up a base scenario or situation with a bunch of different output nodes. And what these output nodes are going to do is give us the different texture maps, or should I say, provide us with the ability to export and visualize these different texture maps, like our normal, our base color, metallic, and roughness. So the one I'm going to select is our PBR metallic and roughness. And this is going to give us base color, normal, roughness, metallic, height, and ambient occlusion. And the reason I chose this template is I know that I'm going to want to use pretty much 99% of these. The only one that I know that we're not going to need is our height. So once we boot into this template here, we're just going to go ahead and delete that, and I'll explain that in a second. So for our graph name, I'm going to call this our megaphone. I'm going to leave the size relative to parent, and we're going to go with a 2K map. So I'm going to hit OK. And you can see that we're booted into a pre-made template. And this is going to have all of our outputs. So our base color, normal, roughness, metallic, ambient occlusion, and our height. And so the reason we're not going to be using height is because normally the height is used for telling a shader to do vertex displacement in a game. We can use a height map to also actually displace the geometry in a modeling application. So we don't really have that kind of use for it on this particular asset because we have all of the mesh maps already baked, and we don't want to have any of that physical displacement of our mesh. So I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of these because we're not going to need them. So now that we've got these 5 outputs here, you can see that we've also got stuff plugged into them. And so what this base PBR template does is it just plugs in some very generic values to allow us to see all of that on our 3D view here. And you can see that by default, we're going to get this cube. And if I come up to scene, you can see that we're going to have a bunch of different 3D meshes that are just, again, packaged with Substance Designer. And this is going to allow us to view our materials on just different meshes to see how they kind of bend and contort and what they kind of look like on different polygons. So how are we going to be able to view our actual mesh in 3D? And so I'm going to come down to my package over here, and I'm just going to open this guy up. And I'm going to select my 3D mesh, right? My 3D object. And I'm going to click and drag and drop that into our project here. And you can see now we've just essentially dragged and dropped our 3D mesh into our scene. And that's how we're going to be able to visualize our mesh. So now I'm able to play around. If I hit Shift and Control and right click to change the lighting orientation, you can see that we're going to pretty much have full access to our model here. The last thing I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and I want to actually bring in all of the mesh maps that I've made prior to this course so that we're going to be able to use them when creating our own personal unique textures. So if I come over to our unsaved package here and I right click, I'm going to go ahead and you can see that we have 2 options. We have import and we have link. And so these 2 options are pretty much going to allow us to do the same thing. However, they have a little bit different use cases as to why you would want to use them. So import is going to take whatever we provide it. In this case, it's going to be our bitmaps, and it's going to essentially make a copy and then bring that in to our Substance Designer. And so now if I am to move these mesh maps over here, if I am to move one of these outside of this folder or move it to a different directory or save this entire package itself in a different place, Substance Designer doesn't really care because it has its own unique copies that it is using. However, if we go ahead and we link a bitmap, what we're doing essentially is giving a direct file path to these guys over here so that if I update one of these, it will actually update in Substance Designer as well because we are using the original versions. That being said, if you're not careful and you decide, yep, I'm going to move this to a different folder, you're going to run into some issue where it is going to be missing the file path and it's not going to be able to find the texture that you're looking for. So that's something to just keep in mind with, because that is one way that you can really mess up your project structure, is just by moving textures around. So if you're going to link these textures, just make sure that they are currently in a directory or a folder that you know you're not going to move them from. So I know that I am pretty happy with these folders here. So I am going to just right click, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to link mine, just in case I have to make any last minute changes on the fly. So I'm going to select bitmap. I'm going to come to our mesh maps here. Oh, making sure that I've got the right one selected. And I'm going to start with our ambient occlusion. So I'm going to double click that guy. And you can see now we've got this resources folder here. And in that, we've got our megaphone ambient occlusion. And you can see this is the direct file path that Substance Designer is going to use to find and reference this image. So you can see if I'm to move this image to a different file place, it's still going to be looking for it in this directory here. And so when it can't find it, that's when we're going to run into some issues. So just keep that in mind. So I'm going to bring this guy into our actual folder here. And you can see now I brought it in as a node, and it is a bitmap. And we've got our bitmap up in here too. So I'm going to get rid of this uniform color, and immediately our mesh is going to go black, because essentially what we've told it is that our ambient occlusion is entirely black. And what the ambient occlusion is essentially the close and fine proximity shadows that you're going to get that are going to be a little bit tougher to calculate with real-time lighting. The problem is that because we've indicated that everything on this mesh is black or shadow, that this entire mesh is actually enshrouded in darkness. So we need to input some values to tell it, no, hey, this whole thing isn't in darkness. We've actually got some lighter areas. So if you ever have a time where your mesh goes completely black, just take a look at what your ambient occlusion output is doing, and you might be able to 99% of the time problem solve on your own. So I'm going to click this guy and bring him in there. And you can see now we're actually going to get a little bit of shadow information. And you can see we're also getting some shadow information right here when there doesn't really seem to be any geometry. And that's okay. That's perfect, because our other mesh maps are going to be able to help us out in kind of faking the idea that we have some geometry there. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to bring in another resource. So I'm going to go link and bitmap. And I'm going to just shift and select all of the remaining maps here. And I'm going to hit open. And you can see now that we've actually brought in all of our maps. We can go ahead and start plugging some in. So for our metallic output, I don't actually have any metallic map. So I'm going to leave that for when we start making things metal and not metal. Our roughness, the exact same, because that's more based off of what we're going to do with our textures and our materials. Our normal, now I do actually have a normal, as you can see, because we're right now using the normal of our low poly. And I've actually baked off of a high poly that I want to use. So I'm going to bring in our normal here. And I'm going to plug this guy in just by deleting that there. And you can see if I position the light here just a little bit better, and I bring this guy in, you can see now, boom, we're immediately going to start using the high poly normal, and our mesh is already going to look a lot nicer. Now, a side note with this that you might want to take into consideration is that this mesh is, or sorry, this normal map is normal DirectX. So if you're not familiar with what DirectX means, all you really need to know is that there are two methods of normal maps, being DirectX and OpenGL. They both are normal maps in their own right. However, they have flipped Y coordinates or green channels for how they display the normal information. So Substance Designer is really great in that it allows us to pick which kind of format we want to work in, which color space or right-handedness we want to work with. But if you start to get some weird looking results with your lights here, it might be worthwhile just to take a look at your preferences and see what normal map you're actually working in, what normal space. So I'm going to come up to Edit and Preferences. And if I come to Projects here, and I come down to General, and I just come down this way, you can see that we have default normal map format. And so if you're not working in DirectX and instead are working in OpenGL, you're going to get some funky results just with this normal map. So I'd encourage you to just change that to DirectX, make sure you hit Apply, and then hit OK. And so that's going to allow you to see the normal map as it is supposed to be viewed, just in case you have any issues there. And coming back up to our base color here, you can see that we actually don't, again, have any base color maps because, well, that's kind of the whole point of what we're doing here, right? We're trying to make a material for our asset here. So what I'm going to do is pull back all of these guys just so they're all lined up. And I'm going to bring these over. So we can think of our process a little bit like this. We've got our starting area. This is the basis for what our mesh is going to look like, what our material is going to look like, how we're going to be able to see, our textures in 3D. What's really cool about Designer is that it's going to allow us to take these inputs, bring them through a bunch of different separate graphs that we're going to make, and it's going to allow us to add on and build on top of these base mesh maps that we already have. And you can see that we've got a lot of different mesh maps here that we haven't quite used yet. And that's because later on, as we start to build a little bit more and a little bit more complex materials and we start to combine them, we're going to have to use different pre-made textures that we can't quite get from node combinations in Designer. So hopefully this is a little bit of a good setup, a good pace to start us on our way to creating some great looking materials. And hopefully you understand a little bit now about how to actually set up Designer for operating and creating a unique game asset material. So in the next video, we're going to take a look at creating our first subgraph that we're going to be able to use to work on our chord material for our megaphone here.